Hello, everyone. My name is Rose Barron, and today I will be discussing the issue of voter suppression of Black Americans by way of voting laws that have been enacted in our country in recent years. Voting rights of Black Americans have been restricted in numerous ways throughout history. Black men were not given the right to vote until the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, and Black women were not able to vote until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. However, even after they were granted suffrage, the black vote was still largely restricted, and it was nearly impossible for many Black Americans to vote until the 1965 Voting Rights Act because of unfair tests given to blacks, like literacy tests, that they were required to pass in order to vote, as well as poll taxes, which were a fee that you had to pay to vote. Today, the black vote is not restricted in such an obvious way as it was in decades past. Instead, lawmakers have used subtle legislative moves and passed laws that make it harder for Black Americans to vote. But it is harder to point out outright discrimination in these cases. One reason that lawmakers can now pass such restrictive laws is that in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. The major blow to the Voting Rights Act was the removal of preclearance, which required states to seek pre approval for new voting rights laws from the U.S. Attorney General or the U.S. District Court to ensure the laws would not be discriminatory against any minority groups. Without preclearance, states are now free to pass these discriminatory laws without any consequence, effectively suppressing the black vote. The first major category of these restrictive laws are laws that restrict mail in voting. Because voting laws are largely determined by the states, mail in and absentee voting varies from state to state. Some states, including California, Colorado, and Washington, allow all of their elections to be conducted by mail, and the process is fairly simplistic. Other states, including many conservative southern states, including Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri, make it much more difficult to vote by mail. Historically, Black Americans have mostly voted in person in elections up until recent years. This makes them fairly less familiar with the process of absentee voting, and many of the states that have restrictions on mail in voting make it very hard to cast absentee ballots. Because of the long list of requirements that these states have, and the fact that absentee voting is more novel for Black voters, their ballots are the ones that are most likely to be rejected by these states, voiding their votes. Another recent but increasingly popular way to restrict voting is the strict voter ID requirements. Many states, including Arkansas, Georgia, and Mississippi, require that voters show a form of ID that has a photo. Sometimes, if identification requirements are not met, voters can cast provisional ballots, which are kept separate from other ballots until a proper form of identification is shown. An example of a state that does this is Alabama, where voters who don't meet ID requirements cast provisional ballots, and they are required to bring the proper form of ID before 5 p.m. on the Friday after Election Day. If not, their ballot is thrown out. Once again, these voter ID laws are passed under the premise that they prevent voter fraud. But voter fraud in the United States is a rare occurrence, and what these laws really do is subtly restrict the black vote. Black voters are less likely to meet the strict ID requirements of these states, and it can be hard to follow the changing ID laws and obtain a proper form of identification right before an election. The final form of voter restriction law that I will be discussing is laws that target early voting. States have passed laws that restrict voting hours to working hours of the day, making it harder for working class Black Americans to get to the polls. Senate Bill 1 in Texas, which was passed on August 31st, 2021, targets voters of color by banning overnight early hour voting and drive through voting. These voting methods were most popular among voters of color. Another bill, House Bill 531, which was passed in Georgia, also bans and eliminates voting methods that are disproportionately used by voters of color. This includes banning mobile voting buses as well as eliminating early in person voting on Sunday. Sundays have been a historically important voting day for Black Americans. Events like Souls to the Polls are one way that many Black voters and activists get out the vote. In closing, all of these laws are being passed by conservative states under the false idea that they are preserving election integrity. when in fact there is little to no evidence that election fraud is taking place in our country, especially not in the large numbers that many Republicans claim it is. Instead, these laws are targeting minority voters and making the voting process, which is supposed to be a right in this country, harder and harder and more discouraging for Black voters, and are discouraged from casting their ballots. Steps that our nation could take to stop the suppression of the Black vote would be to set national voting standards that would make the voting process uniform across the country. Doing this would take away much of the confusion involved in the voting process, as the voting laws today are ever changing. It would also prevent the partisan manipulation of election laws, especially by conservative states trying to suppress the Black vote. Another solution to this problem would be to reinstate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which would once again reinstate preclearance so that the federal government could regulate state voting laws.